Clock is we want to go ahead and get started. This is our first USIT Ag Talk Tuesday of 2025, and our first topic was kind of home strawberry production. We've asked Dr. Natalie Bumgarner to be with us and discuss that with everyone. It's kind of that season. I know it doesn't seem time to be thinking about gardening or anything like that with the cold weather, but I know there's several extension offices that'll offer strawberry plants kind of as a fundraiser, and then people are thinking about buying transplants to get those started this spring. So, Dr. Bumgarner, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Yes, I love to talk about hard, work plants this time of year because all we have to do right now is just order them, and that's the fun, easy part. So, before I share my slide set, I actually wanted to share the website where we have the publication and some of the stuff that I'll be talking about. I often put this slide at the end of my slide set, and then if I get to talking, I may not always get to it. So I wanted to show you where these are located before we start. And Chris is recording, and so you'll have the slide set and all of this. But the website is either uthort.tennessee.edu or just uthort.com. We have a redirect, so either one of those will work. And then you just go down here and click on the fruits button. And under the strawberry tab, we have a publication that is selection, right? So it'll really have all the variety information. I'll talk a lot about that a little bit, but you'll have everything you need there. And then disease control and some of those other things. So all of those resources are easy to find here, and we can always include them with recording and things like that. But that way, you know where things are, and you're not worried about trying to write down or get down that information, because you'll definitely be able to access it at your leisure. And I did go ahead and kind of pop out the chat box, so I've got it here on my other screen, so I can keep talking, but I'll also pay attention to that. And if there's anything I say that's confusing, or if you got a question in the middle, then I'll try to pay attention to that. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So, homegrown strawberries. This is one of the crops probably that was the most memorable for me as a kid. We actually the garden with the green beans and all of that was the middle of the summer, and it was sweaty and just not that much fun. But growing strawberries was truly one of the best parts of summer in my memory. And so there's walking out barefoot to the strawberry patch and picking myself some berries for my morning cornflakes. So there's really nothing better to kick off summer than some fabulous homegrown strawberries. Whether you are canning and freezing and making jams and jellies, or whether you're just throwing a few on your cereal in the morning, it is worth it. And so just a little bit, I always like to talk about a few things about the composition of the produce that we're eating. And so the reason why we love strawberries is the combination of sweetness, acidity, and aromas, right? The volatiles, or the scent of those berries. And in many ways, when we talk about strawberry flavor, it is similar to the realities of, say, tomato flavor, right? We eat tomatoes and we think that we really love ones that are sweet, and we do. But what we're actually often tasting is kind of the combination of the acidity and the sweetness. There, with a few exceptions, we're not just tasting for high sweetness, we're actually tasting for high levels of both sweetness and acidity and the balance thereof, right? And that's also true for strawberries, that if you tasted one that really didn't have any of those natural acids in it, but was just sweet, it might actually be bland. And so, we're really selecting for both of those. And of course, the riper we can get them on the plant, the easier it will be to get to this level of joy in our strawberry eating. The other fun thing about strawberries that you may not know is that they are the the domesticated strawberry that we grow in our gardens, that all of our strawberry producers grow in the field, is actually a cross of a couple different American native strawberries. This is the beach strawberry, or Fragaria chileoensis, and this is Fragaria virginiana. And so this is actually a species that's native to South America, but also kind of the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and California, and up in Washington, Oregon. And this is the berry that is native to our part of the country. So that's kind of the eastern native strawberry. And I will say that I have spent a lot of time in the hills and the woods, and I have never really found a patch of native strawberries. But if you all have, then that's pretty cool. But the interesting thing about our domesticated strawberry is that even though we have these two species in the Americas, the cross of them was actually accidental. It occurred in Europe in the mid 1700s. So they had all been transported to Europe for, of course, the horticultural cultivation that took place there, and that cross was made, and then it came back across the ocean. So the strawberries that we eat are an all-American match, but it was actually made in Europe and brought back to us. So there's your geeky historical facts for the day. And now we're going to jump into the facts of the matter and some information about strawberry growing, how to get started. We're going to talk about a little bit about the types of strawberries, because we have two options for our home garden strawberries. A little bit about site, because many of us will probably be growing in ground, traditionally in soil, but there are also lots of other options that we have as far as raised beds and containers. And we'll talk mostly about matted row, which is the most common growing method that we use in our gardens. It is a multi-year growing method. We'll talk just a little bit about the annual growing method. And I kind of feel like these names are a little bit confusing. Matted row is a multi-year system, and the reason that we say matted row is because as those crops grow, we are actually harvesting off of our original mother plants, but also off of daughter plants, runners, that start and grow. Well, in the annual system, we are really just harvesting primarily off of that one plant that we put in. We're not giving it the time and the space to grow and start other plants. So you could kind of think of this as multi-generational or single generation types of strawberry production. And so whether we're going to grow them for several years or, just that one, that makes a lot of difference in the types of growing systems and the way that we grow them. So we're going to kind of go through a typical growing cycle for matted row production, and then we'll end with some of the common challenges, a few of the diseases that we might face, and some of those aspects. So I already told you where this publication was located. So that is one that we wrote a couple of years ago that has just a little bit of production information, but mostly about cultivar selection. And it goes into these two types of strawberries. So the ones that we probably grow the most and are the most familiar with, that we probably picked on summer mornings in our bare feet, were June bearing, also known as short day. So they fruit in kind of that late spring, early summer period. And then as the summer days get longer, then they go into vegetative growth where they're producing those runners. And then as the days get shorter, again, in the late summer and the early part of the fall, then they set their flower buds. And then the plant, becomes dormant, overwinters. Then when it gets warm again, those flowers bloom and it produces fruit. So short day or June bearing, but in our part of the world, we'll get a lot of May berries off of those as well. The other type, which probably we haven't grown as often kind of in our backyard, but there are more and more cultivars that are available for us, are kind of known by multiple names. So most often over the years, you may have seen these referred to as everbearing. Sometimes now we'll also hear them called day neutral. And these can be long day or they can be day neutral, but essentially just know that they're in some ways kind of reverse of our traditional short day because they are setting flowers, and then those flowers are blooming, and it's kind of going through that summer period. So, everbearing is a little bit of an overly positive term because they are not, in fact, producing all through the growing season. Lots of times, what we'll see is a couple flushes of flowers and then fruit, kind of in the late spring and then again in the late summer or the early fall. Many of these produce fewer runners, so oftentimes they're better, for raised beds and containers and things like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So not everbearing so much as maybe two small crops instead of one large crop of berries. And so when we think about those short day strawberries, which we're probably the most familiar with, some of the pros of those types are it's a concentrated, efficient harvest period, right? Because they're bearing just over a few weeks. If you want to make jams and jellies, if you want to freeze berries, right? It's a concentrated harvest period. And because they are flowering and producing fruit in that late spring, early part of the summer, that yield isn't impacted by hot summers. And of course, they produce many runners, and so these plants reproduce well, and that's an ongoing production. They work well for this matted row. The con, right, or the downside of some of these short day strawberries used in multiple year systems is that those disease issues can build up. And of course, sometimes those runners are not always wanted, if they're in raised beds or containers. So this is a little bit of what those June bearing or short day look like throughout the whole year. I hope this helps to kind of put a little bit of a timeline on that. So right now, our plants are dormant or kind of quiescent. They're resting at this point in time. Strawberries don't go into a full dormancy like, say, our apple trees or, woody plants do, but they are resting. They are sleeping as soundly as they have the capacity to right now. So we'll kind of call that dormancy. Then as the temperature warms up, they will come out of that and start flowering. And then about 30 days after the flower is set, then we'll have fruit. The days get longer and we have runner growth. The days shorten. And typically, we will see, well, we won't see actually, within the crown of those plants, the flower buds will be initiated when the day length gets below about 14 hours. So kind of starting in early August, those flower buds will be initiating. We won't be seeing those. They'll be happening in the crown of the plant. Then the temperature cools, those plants go into dormancy, and the whole cycle starts again. So for most of what we do in our home garden, we will often be planting dormant bare root plants kind of in that late spring period of time. And so that's why right now is a fabulous time to talk about strawberries, because this would be a really good time to go ahead and get those plants ordered, and they'll arrive, early March, mid-March, something like that. And I know because I saw Keith was on here, Macon County, and I'm sure others do strawberry orders. So now is a really good time to be thinking about that. Now, not as many of us do this in our home garden, but the commercial strawberry growers will generally be putting plugs in the ground, and that is a fall planting. So we won't talk as much about that, but those are kind of the two general planting windows: this August to maybe the early part of October, and then this late spring period. So I threw this in there today because I kind of got curious, and I thought that you all might be getting curious as well. So this is a very short rabbit trail. But one of the things that you might be thinking right now is, well, how low a temperature can strawberries handle? And so if you have strawberries growing right now, those initiated buds in the crown of the plant can handle to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as the plants emerge, the temperatures, of course, their risk level goes up. And most of the time it's this bloom period where we really have to worry about those blooms getting killed with, mid to late spring frost. So you'll hear us talk about this the most often, because even though you may be thinking, well, 10 degrees, I mean, we might hit that tonight. keep in mind that the crown of strawberry plants are very close to the ground. So they're going to get the benefit of the protection of leaves, of the surrounding soil body. And most of the time, that is why we put mulch and things like that over our strawberries. And of course, we know that in Ohio and Pennsylvania, there's lots of many cooler regions of the country that grow matted row strawberries, and so they protect the plants with mulch in this times of year and other important things for helping those plants overwinter. Good drainage. Don't fertilize them, in October and have a lot of growth going there. So that was just a little bit about the temperature tolerance levels of strawberries. So we talked about short days, and I just wanted to hit on a few of the most common short day cultivars and the ones that we can easily get our hands on from a lot of different distributors. This is kind of an interesting list for us to talk about, because when we think about the strawberries that we grow in our gardens, many of these are plants that we have grown for many years, right? Honeyo, you can still buy sparkle strawberries, and Lockwood often jokes about how sparkle is what he grew when he was a kid. So many of these are cultivars that have been around for a long time, because for many of these garden cultivars, there isn't as much breeding that's going on. Most of the breeding is really directed towards the Florida, the North Carolina, the Georgia, the California, those annual commercial strawberries. So many of these have been around for a while, but many of them also have a lot of good fruit quality, taste quality, and disease resistance. So early glow is one lots of times that we'll use for an early berry. Good resistance to some of our soil-borne diseases like verticillium, red steel, which is kind of a root crown issue. All Stars are really good mid-season, as well as Jewel. Some that you'll start to see maybe a little bit more are Flavor Fest, Summer Festival. So those are, when I say newer, they might be 90s or 2000s, but good color and flavor. And a lot of these are still grown in home gardens, but also in some of, say, the smaller U-pick operations, maybe in some parts of, the Mid-Atlantic and not necessarily in the South, but kind of those middle regions. What our commercial growers are growing, what you would be eating if you went to a U-pick or a farmer's market in Tennessee, are probably going to be one of a half a dozen different short day cultivars. It always used to be that Chandler was one of the most common, and it still is, but there's more folks growing Camarosa. We're seeing a lot of growers grow the cultivar Ruby June. Many of these are coming out of the University of California breeding program, or some of the private beaters. Ruby June is a Lassen Canyon variety, and so a lot of times these are what you'll be eating. And I'm not saying like don't ever, but there are several of these cultivars that may not have as much disease resistance as some of those that we looked on a previous slide, because these are really bred and selected for that 1 year on a plastic raised bed type of growing system. And so Chandler is an example of one that does not have good anthracnose resistance. So if we would try to grow it for many years in a matted row system, it would be challenging. It would be frustrating for us, because we would have disease issues over that longer growing period of time that, say, a commercial grower doesn't struggle with if they're growing on plastic, if they're just growing for a single year. So I kind of wanted to share some of that with you, just so you kind of know. I mean, these could grow really well for you, but they would probably be better in a shorter production cycle rather than a multi-year. So those were all of the short day or the June bearing types. And then I want to talk just a little bit about some of the everbearing or day neutrals. And so the pros of this type of strawberry is that we have multiple harvest periods, oftentimes a couple. Many of these cultivars have fewer runners, so they may be less management in a raised bed or in a container, and they can fruit sooner, right? So you will actually get fruit in the first year that you plant these, whereas for, say, us, if we planted a June bearing plant, in March of this year, we would remove the fruit, um, any blooms for this summer, and it would be next May or June, right? So 14 months typically before we would get fruit. So we'll get fruit sooner with this type. Um, and they're going to be blooming later in the spring, so we don't have to as much worry about frost and things like that. The the detriments are that they are going to have lower yield in most instances, and that is because our summer heat is such that it puts more stress on those plants during their late spring and summer bloom time, and so that yield is going to be impacted by the hot weather. I just wanted to share a few of the cultivars. If you go to a local berry farm that has berries in February or March or April, kind of the early season, and they're growing in tunnels, it may well be that they're growing Albion. We see a lot of these in some of our high tunnels and things like that. I've grown them in greenhouse systems. They're good flavor, a really beautiful tapered fruit. And you can grow those in raised beds or in containers. They do have a little bit more runner production than some of these other day neutrals or everbearing, but they do have some pretty good disease resistance. And if you kind of push them with a little bit of nitrogen, they can be very productive. Another of the options that we're starting to see more commercially is San Andreas. If you go to a garden center or a home garden catalog, Seascape is probably the cultivar that you will see the most often for some of these day neutral or everbearing types. Good size and flavor, and really heavy rainfall, you might see some splitting, but kind of a good all-around performer. These are some cultivars developed by the USDA, and I believe the 90s. Probably not quite the taste that you might get out of the Seascape or the Ozark Beauty. Ozark Beauty we'll still see in garden catalogs. I've seen it in garden centers and packs. It's an older cultivar, so developed in the 50s. But so it might not have the yield as some of these newer ones, but it does have good taste. I As we're finishing up this discussion about cultivar, I just had one, final little geeky note on these, and that is that when it comes to blackberries and blueberries, we have some of our own trials going, but we don't have any current UT trials on strawberries. So we don't have our own like on station data. Not like, if I talk about tomatoes, I grew these, I picked them and I have yield data. So we don't have as much of that, but there are a lot of our neighbors that do commercial strawberry trials. And so, we kind of know about those sorts of yield trials. But the thing is that they are not doing trials on things like Jewel and All Star. So we don't have, yield data and trial data on those kind of older garden types of cultivars at this time. I hope to get some of them in the ground over the next few years. Actually, I'll tell you, in the year 2020, I decided that was going to be a strawberry year, and I ordered a whole bunch of strawberries, and we were going to do strawberries in my own plots and a bunch of demonstration gardens and things throughout the state of Tennessee. And I mean, you know how 2020 went, and those strawberries all arrived when we were like, on full don't go anywhere lockdown. So we did not get the strawberry trials planted, but we'll get that going again here before too long, hopefully. So now let's talk a little bit about production and some of the, kind of management and technique practices. So many of us are going to be growing in ground. And so good drainage is really important for strawberries. They can grow in more clayey types of soils, but those really need to be well drained. And so loamy is better. And of course, much of the production of strawberries in the southeast is done in sandy soil. So they do really like good drainage. Just slightly below neutral pH. And an important thing to know about strawberries, especially for home gardeners, when we think about what this looks like in reality in our backyards, is that we want to make sure that we have 3 or 4 years of grass or of sweet corn or something. Like, we don't want to follow tomatoes or peppers or eggplants or some of those really common garden solanaceous crops, because there are some soil-borne diseases like verticillium that can transfer with some of those crops. So, longer rotations, don't immediately follow a vegetable garden. All right, so we talked a lot, or I've mentioned about matted row, and I just wanted to share a little bit more in detail of how that production system works. So we plant those in the spring, early spring, for a full harvest the next late spring, early summer. And most of the time, we would think that we'll get 3 or 4 years out of those plants. That is not guaranteed. And you might have plants that are older than that, but that's kind of what the sequence would look like with pretty good care in the Southeast, which does have some pretty heavy disease pressure. And most of the time in matted row systems, we want to use some of those cultivars like Early Glow, Late Glow, Jewel, All Star, Cavendish, Delmarvel, Dar Select, those kinds of cultivars that were really bred more for multi-year systems. So when we're thinking about selecting that growing system, one of the great things about matted row is that it costs less to establish. We have a really wide variety of cultivars that we can order right now. It can produce for many years, but it does require summertime management. So we'll talk about renovation. That's one of the biggest things to think about when we're talking about home strawberry production. We've already talked just a little bit about the annual system. So lots of times that's going to be a fall planting. Well, that's the way the commercial guys do it. But if you go to the garden center and, buy packs of strawberries, you can grow those, from spring to spring as well. But typically it's a fall planting, summer harvest, and then those plants come back out. But if you don't want to deal with runners, if you don't want to deal with renovation, if you have a raised bed, if you just want to grow in some containers, then by all means consider growing strawberries for just 1 year. So it can be higher yielding because we don't have that disease load. We don't have as many plants close together as we might in a matted row. Those young, fresh plants often have a lower disease pressure. They can fit really well with some of our other types of growing spaces like raised beds and containers, but it can be more expensive. And it's important to keep in mind that for that late spring, those plants might start blooming earlier than they would if we had a traditional matted row system. So you might need some row covers or some frost protection for some of those plants. We don't grow annual strawberries as much in the home garden, but they are grown in beautiful systems like this all across the country. So really kind of dig into what that typical home garden production sequence looks like. We're just going to talk about from like right now in the early spring through typical management for a multi-year matted row system. So this is the time of year when we get to shop to our heart's content. I literally think that as one of y'all were sitting down, somebody had like a seed catalog that they were looking at. I saw it wave across the screen. So it's beautiful January entertainment. We want to get disease-free plants from good reputable dealers. Order early for good selection, and most of the time these are going to be dug out of very sandy soils and shipped to us bare root and dormant, although you may buy some growing plants in garden centers. I wanted to share this source with you, and actually let me see if I've still got I do. I still have the link saved as well. So this is a Google Doc that we have that is, everybody can look at it. It's just an open link. You can't edit it, but you can look at it. And it just has some of the most common short day and early bearing and June bearing cultivars, and just some of the options for suppliers. And you can see that we are not recommending, a specific supplier, but we just want to provide information about the many good places that you can go to buy these cultivars. And this sheet has different tabs for different crops as well. So these lists are actually come from our selection extension pubs, and we just try to look over these and update them so that it's an easy resource for people to find the cultivars that we're recommending in those fruit publications. All right, so those plants come to you. They are bare root, and you can store those for a short period of time in the refrigerator. I would definitely open them up and kind of look and see how they've been shipped, make sure that there's not, say, moist paper around the leaves and things like that. Because yes, they can store in a refrigerator, but I've also seen times when, I just get deterioration in my bare root plants pretty quickly. So hopefully they come when you have the soil prepped and you're really ready to just go out and plant. Sometimes those roots will be kind of dry, a little bit, I mean, hopefully not completely, but slightly dehydrated. So it's good to place roots in a bucket of water for an hour or so before planting. I've actually had several of the bare root strawberry plants that I get where they actually include some of that hydrogel and things to put in the water to help rehydrate those roots. And then I bet for anybody that has ever seen a strawberry publication, you have seen an image that looks like this. So how the depth at which we plant those plants is going to be really important. We want to set that crown just above the soil line. And this is one of those things that, every time you read anything about how to plant plants, it always says spread the roots. And of course, we know that it makes sense. All good. I will say that of almost any plants that I plant, I think that bare root strawberries are one of the most frustrating to plant because those roots, as they're dug out of sandy soil, are actually several inches long, and it takes really well-worked soil and some time and patience to actually spread those roots. Sometimes what I will do on my bare root strawberries is trim them a little bit. Not a ton, and I do this gently, but to kind of get any damaged or dead ends off of those and to save myself a little bit of time in trying to get them all spread out in the soil. So most of the time we'll set those out about a foot and a half or so within the rows, and this is to allow room for those runners to root. So this is for matted row growing. As we say, for most of our garden plants, we're aiming for 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. And with strawberries, because we have so many leaf diseases that we can have the potential to have here in Tennessee, if we can do drip irrigation on those would actually be best, because overhead can lead to the easier spread of diseases and even some of those fruit molds, like botrytis and things like that. We can kind of think of overhead irrigation as sneezing, right? So we try to keep those leaves as dry as possible. When it comes to nutrient management, it's always good to get a soil test, and that soil test will give us the pre-plant fertilization recommendation. And lots of times that pre-plant will have N, P, and K, right? So it'll kind of be a complete fertilizer as long as we're not already excessive in phosphorus and potassium, that P and K from the soil test. We'll get them planted, get them growing, keep them watered. And for that first year of matted row production, we are going to remove the blooms. And that is because we want those plants to invest all of their energy in growing roots and growing runners and growing that mother plant in that crown. And then we will pick them in the next summer. So we'll fertilize again in June, and then in kind of late August or early September. We don't want to fertilize beyond that so that we can give those plants a chance to go into their rest period without that push nitrogen that's going to really actively keep them growing. And what we'll often see in those recommendations is it could be a complete fertilizer, but once again, if you have high P and K, lots of times it'll be fine for that summer fertilizer to just be nitrogen, whether bone meal or blood meal or an ammonium nitrate. And then once those plants get completely dormant, which for us in Tennessee might be, this might be Christmas time or something. We don't have to mulch them in October or really early, but we want to get them mulched in before we go into the coldest parts of winter. We'll use something like straw that's breathable and where we can see just a few leaves. But as we talked about earlier, when we were talking about the temperatures that they can withstand, remember, we want to protect the crown of that plant. It's okay if we have a few leaves sticking up, but we want to maintain the temperature around that crown of the plant. Then as they start to come out in the spring, we'll pull back that mulch. It's great for mulching the aisles, and then we can apply more mulch in between the rows as needed. So the hardest job in backyard strawberries, if we're growing in a matted row, of course, is this task of renovation. And the first time that we will do this will be when the plants are, if we say we put them in the ground in March, it'll be when the plants are 15 or so months old. So it's going to be after their first bearing season, which means that they have now had a whole summer to have runners and daughter plants that are just growing, and they're going to be quite matted by this point in time, right? We're going to have those mother plants, and then we're going to have a lot of daughter plants. And so what our goal is to take that whole area of now densely growing with strawberries and reduce it back so that we actually have, a aisleway between those plants. And so, say if when we planted this, we had, a row of mother plants here and we tried to get the runners to grow this direction, we could till this side of the bed so that we're reducing the width, but we're leaving a lot of those younger plants. So what we're doing is just kind of cycling this bed, pulling out, removing, tilling in those older plants and leaving those younger plants with, more airspace, room to root, room to fruit, and an aisleway for us to work in. And we actually have some pictures here. Some of the fine folks to South Dakota took these plants. So with some good protection, you can actually grow strawberries in South Dakota. And so this is a summertime picture of strawberries. We can see they're well growing in a very, very matted row system. And if you have a small area, you can literally clip the tops of those plants with, pruner shears or loppers, but you can also mow the tops if it's a larger growing area. You just don't want to mow too low because, of course, we want to clip the leaves, but we don't want to touch any of those crowns. And then we're going to narrow rototill so that we kind of recreate rows. And then we're going to give them some fertilization, brush it off the tops of the leaves, water it in well, and here you can kind of see what that process looks like. So in this example, if our older plants have been grown in here, these are our younger plants, and we're just kind of mowing them off, tilling them in. It looks vicious, right? But it is a very productive system to renovate and kind of reinstill vigor and productivity in that growing area. And it's going to get a little friendly companion there with the hound. A few final thoughts on matted row production. You may renovate for multiple years if those plants are staying healthy. And maybe you get 4 or 5 years out of that growing area. Maybe you only renovate, once or twice to get 3 or 4 years. But make that decision based on the health of the plants. If you're starting to get leaf diseases, if you're starting to lose plants or seeing berry diseases, then, pull them out and put some strawberries in a new growing area because we always want to keep them as healthy and productive as possible and buy new plants for those growing areas. And we struggle with a lot of diseases here. And if you're battling diseases, then, by all means, just put in some new plants. Because we typically grow matted row the most, I want to kind of spend the most time on that and hopefully walk you through a whole growing sequence. But I also wanted to throw in just a little bit of information about what it might look like in, say, an annual growing system. So if you had raised beds and you got some plugs or strawberries in the late summer or the fall, you could grow them really well in a small raised bed like this. One thing to keep in mind is with that, warmer soil temperature that we'll see in that raised bed, because it'll warm up earlier in the spring and things like that, they're going to bloom earlier than they would if they were growing in a matted row. So, hoops over that raised bed to protect those blooms in the springtime will be really good. And you also want to keep in mind that raised bed media grows out faster, so make sure that you have some irrigation to keep those well watered. I haven't talked a ton about raised beds, but strawberries grow really well in these types of systems. I always think that it's fun how the gardening world, might like much of the rest of kind of fashion and fads, goes in sequence. And so what I saw as a kid growing up, like, the 80s strawberry towers are back, right? So we're seeing lots of fun examples of different ways to grow strawberries, and this is just one of those examples. This one is very well mulched in with some permeable ground cover, you can see there. So you could certainly use a system like this to grow everbearing, or day neutral strawberries. But you could also let runners, of course, you couldn't do it with this much landscape fabric, but you could let runners grow and, kind of have a more upright matted row system growing in here. And if you're talking about the number of plants like this, you can get a real volume out of this type of raised bed. If you are going to grow multi-year strawberries in a raised bed or in a tower system like this, it is going to require closer management, but you can get to these plants, right? So if you think about what this could look like as a matted row, you would just be intentional about letting runners grow, and then you could pull out that mother plant. So you wouldn't be using a tiller, you wouldn't be using a mower. You could literally kind of do that renovation by hand, and you could let your mother plants, have a couple of daughter plants, and then just remove the older plant in that summertime renovation. This can be a great way to get around poor drainage or disease issues in your soil. One of the biggest challenges that we have with matted row strawberries is weed control, right? So raised beds are a great way that you can really get good weed control as well. Especially if you're talking about everbearing or day neutral plants that don't have as many runners, then small space containers can really grow well. This is more for grazing than it is for making a bunch of strawberry jam, but you can get berries in that first summer. Make sure you put those in a site that really gets good sunlight. Don't skimp on the moisture or the nitrogen. Make sure you have them in a large enough container that they're not drying out quickly, but they can do really well in those systems. I just threw in a couple of pictures here to kind of give you some ideas about what are possible. If you happen to do some tunnel growing, tunnel strawberries can be a great option. This is actually a picture from Tennessee just a year or so ago. These are Albion strawberries, as a matter of fact, in a tunnel, and I believe this is the early part of March. So you can see that they're being careful about the way that they manage those, putting on row covers and things to protect those blooms from less than 30-degree temperatures. But whether you're growing for yourself or maybe selling a few, this can be a growing system that works really well. Of course, this happens a bunch in Florida, but we can replicate it in our own system as well. Now, a lot of the tools of the trade when people are growing for just a single season is they're going to be growing in raised beds for really good growth and drainage. But our raised beds could, be wooden, right? And we could still get the same weed control. We could put mulch over them like we saw on that strawberry tower. These types of raised beds are really good to have more uniform moisture and things like that. But once again, we will probably have to protect those plants in the early spring because they'll take off a little bit faster than they will in soil. My final note is that if you are a backyard strawberry grower, there's lots of fun that can be had, with some of the hydroponic or soilless strawberry systems. These are much harder to make money with. I had before I came to Extension, I worked in the hydroponic industry, and one of the older guys that I used to work with had like his corny jokes, and one of his stock corny jokes was, You know how you can make $1 million growing hydroponic greenhouse strawberries? And of course, the room would be excited about the profitability with strawberries. And he would be like, you start with 2 million. And that was the joke, right? So the theme is that uh, we could probably be much more profitable growing in soil. But if we don't have to worry about making money, there's lots of fun ways that we can grow strawberries. I grow them a lot in our teaching greenhouses here, in beta bucket or hydroponic systems. Now, they don't like to be grown like lettuce, not with the roots continually moist. So we'll grow them in, peats or perlite bags. But for small scale, it can be fun. So, just some final notes on those small space types of growing. It really opens up our harvest period because we can get some late summer, we can get some fall. You can even think about, say you have some day neutral strawberries, and we know that one of the big challenges is they get, the heat of our summers can sometimes really reduce the late summer and early fall bearing. So, we could put them in, a place that gets a little bit of afternoon shade or something, kind of reduce a little bit of that heat load. But they are going to require more time and attention and water and nutrient management and runners. And strawberries do not like to, have high salinity, right? So if we're growing them in kind of non-soil systems, we have to be careful not to over fertilize or get kind of too much salt in their growing media. And then of course we get to the payoff, and that is our harvest season. So the berries are going to ripen about 30 days after those flowers bloomed. And for best taste and color, we want to pick them at least 3/4 ripe, but we should just let them go all the way. Pick them in the morning before they pick up heat from the field, and then we don't want to get them down to freezing, but we'll try to cool them quickly to just a little bit over freezing. And well stored, they can last for 5 to 10 days in our refrigerator. Before we finish, I just wanted to share a couple of notes about some of the diseases that we sometimes see in strawberries. And I know I've mentioned these, but I just want to give a little bit more detail about them because this really comes into play when we talk about selecting our cultivars and kind of how we manage the system. So we do not, have like a preventative spray schedule or anything like that. If you see leaf diseases, make sure we know what we're dealing with, and then decide if you want to use fungicides. But for the most part, what we'll be doing is trying to avoid the environments that lead us to have struggles with disease. One of the disease problems that we used to see a lot more often in strawberries, but we now have a lot more resistance to, was called red steel. And so it was common in heavy, cold, moist soils, and it led to this stunting and wilting that we see. And this is what it looks like. So, reddening of the root steel, or the center of the root there. But what we know now is that if we select well, and you can see a lot of these common garden strawberries, All-Star, Early Glow, Flavorfest, are actually resistant to red steel. So this is something that we should be able to largely avoid in a lot of our home garden growing. Another one that you could see, but we also have some pretty good resistance in a lot of cultivars, is common leaf spot. And this is one of the really interesting things, that for the strawberries that were bred and developed more for a multi-year or a matted row type of system, and these are the ones that we've talked about several times, right? Early Glow, All-Star, Jewel, Late Glow. We tend to see a lot more resistance to this common leaf spot, whereas the berries that were developed for more annual systems don't have as much resistance. So it's just another kind of built-in advantage that we have as home gardeners for the cultivars that we're growing. Now, one that we probably will commonly see issues with is anthracnose. And so it can impact leaves, it can impact crayons, clearly, and fruit. And as most diseases are, they are more of an issue in warm, moist climates, which we definitely have, and they can impact multiple parts of the plant. So some of the cultural practices, we definitely want to start with clean plants. We want to have good air movement, get those leaves as dry as quickly as possible, good mulching practices so there's not a lot of splashing that's occurring. And if necessary, we can use fungicides, but in general, what I would kind of say is if as a home gardener you are seeing large amounts of anthracnose, if you're having struggles with fruit rots and things that look like this picture, then I would definitely consider that it might be time to kind of revamp and bring in some new strawberry plants, because it's just hard for us to fight this effectively with the fungicide tools that we have for home gardeners. And there are several of the cultivars that we have available to us that do have some resistance to anthracnose. And this goes back to what I was saying about some of the commercial production annual culture strawberries don't have as much resistance to this. Chandler, Cramarosa, this HS stands for highly susceptible. So this is a lot of the reason why some of these we may not use as much in our home gardens, whereas some of these, Flavor Fest, Strawberry Festival, some of these that are more for annual, for multi-year systems can have more resistance. A disease that we won't really have much resistance to, which we definitely need to prevent with good cultural practices, with air movement, with making sure that we don't have so many plants packed in so much that the leaves and the fruit are staying moist, is gray mold, right? So this is one that we'll see a lot if our plant density gets too high, or if we just have a really wet spring. This can be one that's hard to control. And so it's not that there is nothing that's labeled for it as far as fungicides. It's just that cultural environmental control is the best way to address these issues. So air circulation, sanitation, make sure that we're not really over fertilizing. But we do actually have, a little bit of resistance in some of our home garden cultivars. One thing that I wanted to mention right before I finish up is that we do have a disease that's kind of an emerging threat. It has a very long name, as you can see, but lots of times you'll just hear people say neop. And so it's a fungal disease that can impact leaves, fruit, crown, and what is really happening is that it's coming from the propagators, certainly not on purpose, unintentionally, but it's coming in when people are buying their tip cuttings and plugs and things like that. And so we're seeing it more in those really common commercial cultivars because those growers are ordering plants every year. So they're really cycling quickly through those propagators. And often it'll show up first as this leaf disease, but as the plants get a higher fruit load on them, then the whole plants can go down. And so far in those commercial systems, we haven't really seen anything that's, say, completely resistant, but there are some that have a little bit more resistance. So here's what I would say to home gardeners. Now, for commercial growers, this is scary, right? Many of the propagators are having trouble eradicating this. That's a challenge. But for us as home gardeners, we haven't seen it as much in some of those cultivars that are coming in with bare root cuttings. But what I would say to gardeners, especially as we head into the next couple of strawberry growing seasons, is that if you see leaf diseases, then, send in a sample. Let's make sure that we know for sure what we have, whether it's anthracnose, whether it's leaf spot, whether it's one of these newer diseases that we haven't seen in as much. This would be a good year to really know what it is that we're dealing with. So, and because what the lab is going to do is some of these are even hard to identify by eye. And so lots of times what they'll do is culture it, right? So they'll put it in a petri dish, they'll plate it, and they'll see what grows so that they can actually put those spores under a microscope to make sure that they identify that thoroughly. So to the best of our ability, we'll avoid those diseases with good selection and with good management. But if you happen to run into them, this is it's a good time to make sure that we know exactly what we're dealing with. So I did actually have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions or thoughts, and I will stop my share. here. And
You have a question, Natalie, in the chat that asked about companion
companion planting.
companion plants.
That is a good question that I am not sure that I have a good science-based answer for. I would say good companion plants are not tomatoes or peppers or some of those. I would say that if you want to plant this around some of your flowering herbs or some of some cutting garden types of flowers, nothing that'll shade it. But I didn't mention this in my presentation, but however, strawberry flowers are self-pollinating, but we will get bigger, we will get better food if we have pollinator, visitation on those. So I would say good companion plantings could be things that, attract pollinators and provide some good floral diversity. And once again, like make sure you kind of rotate widely to different plant families. It's not that strawberries can't work well in your home garden. It's just that we want to make sure we keep them away from some of those, tomatoes and peppers and things that have similar disease profiles.
Any other questions in chat? You can type them in chat if you have any more questions. If not, I want to thank Natalie for her time. Those of you that are on while you're looking at questions, I do want to remind you we'll be back on in February. We're going to have Mr. Justin Stefanski. He's going to be doing a presentation on the home landscape. He's going to talk about some plants that you will use and not use. I'm not going to ruin the title. I'll let him tell you the title when he gets on there, but it's a very good presentation.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about renovating your home landscape, it's one that you want to pay attention to.
He's fun with that presentation. I've heard him
Yes.
Give it. And we geeky folk, I tend to, get stuck on the data, and Justin will flat out give you his opinion on stuff. And if he doesn't like it, by golly, he will tell you. Patricia put a comment in the chat that was asking about watering, and I would say that we have had a fair amount of moisture this winter, and it's possible that if you're growing in soil, say in a tunnel, there's going to be a little bit of water movement, that it's possible that we haven't had a lot of soil drying. So I mean, I wouldn't worry about them as much if they were growing in soil, but you could always do just a little bit of hand watering, even if your irrigation isn't on. But we don't want them to get completely dried out, but also too much moisture in the wintertime is probably worse than a little bit on the dry side. So I just kind of do a little bit of a finger check and see what that moisture is, because they'll dry out slow this time of year.